But those experiences made me realize, wow, once you stop debating a goal and you say, no, it's not about whether you can hit this goal, it's how you're going to hit this goal. The creativity that opens up in your mind and everybody's mind, the possibilities that open up, hence possibility-oriented thinking, is just incredible.
Hello, this is Shawn Budde of Ensemble X, and this is the Ensemble X Exchange podcast. Today I'm talking with Kunal Kaul about his experience underwriting across underserved markets at Tala. After earning his MBA at Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, Kunal started his career at Capital One. He started as a senior product manager, but then he transitioned to become a credit analyst. Over time, he became a credit officer. He had a unique journey at Capital One where he did almost every role in the value chain of lending, culminating in a role as head of home equity and retail mortgage P&L. He has since had leadership positions at Prosper Marketplace and most recently, Tala, where he was the chief risk and strategy officer. In his spare time, Kunal enjoys watching movies, approximately 100 a year, meditating, and eating out. He is also a self-appointed gelato aficionado. So the obvious first question is, what is your favorite gelato flavor?
Oh, wow. Favorite still has to be dark chocolate, so I'm pretty boring that way.
Yeah.
But I do like nutty flavors like pistachio or hazelnut.
Yeah, my first trip to Italy, I would combine dark chocolate with lemon, and they would always give me a lot of side-eye for that. They did not like that combination. I recently read it. Well, I won't say I read. I purchased a book matching cocktails to noir movies. And so given your two passions, you might want to think about how you would pair gelatos with certain movies. So Kunal, we met a long time ago when I was in India recruiting on behalf of Capital One, recruiting you and some other great folks out of the IIM there. It's a really fascinating process compared to the US process.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how it's different in India?
Yeah, thank you, Shawn. Gosh, this was 23 years ago. Unlike the US, where most people are, I believe, interviewing through the second year of their business school year, in IIM at that point, it was around 75 companies who would come to India to campus for 4 days. And they would recruit, all the recruiting would happen within those 4 days. And the process was pretty unique in the sense that every student had to rank order their companies of interest such that you could not hold on to any more than 2 jobs at the same time. So if in your pecking order, you got 2 job offers, if you were interviewing for something above that and you don't know the result yet, you can keep interviewing. Otherwise, if you get your highest priority and a second job, you have to drop out of the process. And then finally, it required tremendous mental grit because if you were not getting offers or you were being declined by companies, you had to keep interviewing for the entire 4 days, just finding a way to pick yourself up.
Yeah, there were lots of interesting aspects to it. I mean, so as you mentioned, like you picked your favorite companies. So the best companies always came like on the first day, or the most popular companies. I guess the last day was the companies that were least popular. It is interesting that in a country, I would say, where very few things seem to operate efficiently, this is the most efficient interviewing process I'd ever seen. Because you didn't have people interviewing with companies just because or for practice or anything like you see in the US. And I remember we'd interview people, we'd make offers. We'd interview in the morning, we'd interview again in the afternoon. We'd make an offer and we'd go to dinner with people who were going to come work for us. I will tell you one funny story. This was in Kolkata. Another thing that's interesting is it was, as I recall, it was always run by the first year students. So they had never actually seen the process run before. And so they were learning on the job. And we had interviewed a whole bunch of candidates in the morning and had made our list for the afternoon. And a lot of the afternoon students were standing there. And we had to call. He had to call over to kind of the central office to say, we want to interview Kunal. Like, has he been made an offer by someone else and therefore isn't allowed to interview? And that whole process was just jammed up. We had 6 empty rooms with interviewers. We had a bunch of candidates out there. And I went out to this poor first-year student who was wearing his much larger uncle's sport coat. And I told him I was going to have to start crossing names off the list. In essence, I threatened to shoot hostages. He looked his second-year students in the eyes and saw that he was not in a good situation at that point. So he started letting candidates in. But it is fascinating compared to the U.S., right, where you start interviewing people in October and they maybe show up a year later after you've done a lot to woo them. The contrast is pretty stunning.
Fascinating insight. And I just want to share with the audience that, Shawn is the reason I am in the US. That interview was the final interview and it went well. And
Is that right?
From what I know from my seniors who were in the room, Shawn swayed the decision to hire me, and I'm very grateful.
All right. Well, I will admit I don't remember that, but I feel vindicated at least for having argued in your favor. So let's talk about that transition. So you got hired. I assume, had you ever been out of India at that point?
No, just for one vacation, and that's it. Never otherwise had I left India.
All right. So what was it like, going straight out of business school and coming to the US?
So it was easy in some ways and extremely difficult in others. But Capital One did a fantastic job. I think Sam Deshpande was a sponsor of this cultural transition program for folks like us. What we were told upfront was that work would be easy.
Mm-hmm.
Because even as an intern, we used to work, 12, 15 hours a day. So they had told us work would be easy, but life outside work would be very difficult because we were not independent as 24-year-olds coming to the US. So it was grocery shopping and cooking and doing laundry. All of those things were more difficult. I have incredible stories that I think one day I need to write a book. We almost didn't survive in our first month in the US because we didn't know what left turn yield on green means. So we almost drove into head-on traffic. We almost lost a friend who didn't know there are no U-turns on the highways. So he almost drove from Richmond to Charlottesville, that's 60 miles for the audience, waiting for a U-turn to show up. We didn't know the difference between dishwashing liquid and a dishwasher, tab. So we just have so many stories. It would be like a great dark comedy. So personal life took quite a bit of adjustment and learning to be more independent. But work was relatively easier, and Capital One did a fantastic job, the managers, the leaders, of ensuring through the first 3 months, we were able to transition effectively across life and work.
Yeah, it is interesting. I remember, in India, I don't think there's any concept of yielding period in traffic. And I've definitely seen people driving up the exit ramp to enter the highway, et cetera. So I remember actually Reena Singh, who did the recruiting coordinating over in India,
Yes,
telling me how scary it was to drive in the US, which was a very confusing concept for me because there's lanes and all that. But I guess, you just have to get used to the differences. So you came out of school, you're at Capital One, you did a pretty wide variety of roles. What is it that you learned in your time at Capital One, and what did you gain by having kind of that variety of roles?
Yeah, I think, it was an incredible almost 14-year journey. I like to summarize when I left Capital One, I was an 18-year-old wanting to leave my parents' house. Didn't mean I hate my parents. Just eternally grateful, unbeatable learning over 14 years. So I divide my learnings into, maybe two types of learnings, what I would call technical learnings versus maybe non-technical. Now, some people might not like that phrasing, but I think it'll make sense as I talk through it. So in terms of technical learning, just the fundamentals of lending, good analytics, understanding not only the physics of lending, but the math of lending. Right? For physics of lending, for me, is all around consumer behavior and selection dynamics and how integrated product and the experience need to be to lending. I call all of those things physics versus the math being, just understanding how sensitive lending economics are, how much on a knife edge they lie, why it's so difficult, how to, not get tricked by patterns, how to understand, correlation versus causation. Like all those technical learnings, physics as well as the math, were just phenomenal. And then non-technically, just the soft skills around collaborating, caring for people, developing talent or people, leadership skills, curiosity. As from a lending perspective and going to credit college, you saw so many lessons learned. There was a ton of humility that came in, ton of curiosity as well. What could go wrong? Maybe some healthy paranoia, not being overly confident. And then I would say the last couple of things, I definitely saw glimpses, maybe more in startups, but in Capital One, I saw glimpses of what possibility oriented thinking can look like. So there were occasions in Capital One when, some big things happened where you required to completely reimagine how you would do things. And those moments have just been unbelievable memories and learnings that helped me as I transitioned to the startup world.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think, Capital One has been the training ground for a lot of folks who've been very successful elsewhere, in particular, I think, in startups. But talk to me a little more about possibility oriented thinking. I haven't heard that term before.
Yeah, so, several examples, but maybe a quick example. I think I was maybe in year one at Capital One. And, every February we used to send out change in terms on credit cards. And if you have to send change in terms to 40 million customers, sending 40 million pieces of mail is very expensive. So you usually used your statements to send the change in terms. That process in credit card used to take around, I believe, 90 days, right from inception, to come up with the change in terms, to get all the approvals, get all the collateral ready, get the printing, the language. I believe it was 5 days before it was supposed to go live that the CEO said, hey, these change in terms I don't agree with them from a customer perspective. And oh, by the way, I need new ones, and they still have to be delivered on time in February. So the entire company had to do what they used to do in 90 or 120 days in 5 days. Or another example, I think it was 2008 or 9, Capital One had acquired a bank. We had two different unsecured lending operations teams. I was told, actually, I should remember the date. It was 2009, sometime in late March. I was told, hey, Kunal, you're going to run the combined business. Why don't you figure out a way to combine the operations? My daughter was about to be born, so I spent time with my leadership team saying, hey, why don't you all come up with a plan during the 2 weeks parental leave that I'm going to be out for? I laid out some framework. When I came back, they laid out a 6-month plan to combine people, technology, processes, everything. And I had an amazing leader at that time that you'll know, Dave Wosick. Dave Wosick came to me and said, hey, 6 months is too long a period. There are 200 people in that team who we can absorb into other roles if you can make this happen within 6 weeks. Kunal, he said this in the unbelievably gentle manner, as everybody knows Dave Wosick. He said, Kunal, I'm going to approve an urgent flight for you. Why don't you go down, meet the 200 people, see their faces, see pictures of their families? You'll make better decisions. And that phrase of you'll make better decisions, we came back. I shared the story with the team. I said we have 6 weeks. We questioned everything to make those 6 weeks happen. How we spend our time, how we make decisions, how we problem solve. All constraints were lifted. Essentially, you couldn't say no. You had to figure out how. And we made it happen within 6 weeks. And it was such an incredible feeling. And so these moments have happened from time to time at Capital One. They are required all the time in startups. But those experiences made me realize, wow, once you stop debating a goal and you say, no, it's not about whether you can hit this goal, it's how you're going to hit this goal. The creativity that opens up in your mind and everybody's mind, the possibilities that open up, hence possibility oriented thinking, is just incredible.
Yeah, I like that. I at one point took responsibility for all the direct mail at Capital One, and it was taking 12 to 16 weeks to get mail out. And I said, I think we can get this down to 4. And candidly, I probably didn't think we could get it down to 4, but if we got it to 6, I was going to be pretty happy. The team started by saying, well, we're just going to run things faster. And I'm like, that's just,
No.
nothing operates better when you run it faster, right?
Yes.
So yeah, they had to do a reset, and then they came up with an entirely different approach based on lean manufacturing, and we got it down to 6. And I think within a year, we had it down to 4. So I hadn't heard that term. I like that idea, though. That's a really great thought. Okay, so let's talk about Tala.
Yep.
And for those of us who aren't familiar with Tala, what is Tala all about?
Yeah, so it's been one of my most fulfilling roles in my career. Tala serves what we like to call a global majority. It is very surprising for people probably to learn in this audience, but the global majority makes around a median income of $10 a day. So that's it. $10 a day, $300 in a month. That's half the world. And Tala is solving, financial well-being and financial health for this segment through access to capital, through wallet-like solutions to help them save money, grow their money. And there are also some, bill pay solutions, etc., being tried out in different countries. The predominant product, of course, life to date has been access to capital. You have this customer who either is accessing capital to smoothen out their cash flow. So think about it. I think one of the biggest spikes we see in the year is August, when they have back to school expenses.
Yeah.
And they realize, wow, from a budgeting perspective, this is a little bit more money than I had. You sometimes have Uber drivers who realize, wow, I woke up in the morning, I need more money for gas. And they smoothen out their cash flow and maybe they pay you back within a day or 2 days. And then you also have some folks who want to grow their small businesses. So we've had, customers who started off by realizing, like a single mother who wanted to make food and sell food in her neighborhood, started small scale, realized the demand started picking up, but she doesn't have the working capital to buy more ingredients. So she borrows from Tala, buys more ingredients, starts selling more. Next thing she realizes, she needs a mini refrigerator. She comes back to Tala. So at a broad level, the predominant product has been access to capital, either for personal use cases or, business use cases. But it has been eye-opening for me how 90% of the users are mixed use. It's an interesting concept for all of us who live in stable jobs and one job. We try to divide ourselves into, are we self-employed or are we employed? Most of these global majority, folks at least have two jobs, if not three. They have a full-time job, they have a part-time job, they have a side hustle. And when they borrow, they're borrowing for mixed use cases. But that's kind of essentially Tala. Tala is helping consumers who are in the global majority, access money, save money, grow money.
Got it. And in what markets are they doing that?
So far, Tala is in Kenya, Philippines, and Mexico. There has been some work done in India, and there are a couple of other places that are being explored, but predominantly in Kenya, Philippines, and Mexico.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of work in Latin America in particular. It is an interesting transformation that's going on, which is, I think, in a lot of those markets, the top 5% of people have been very well banked for a long time, but it works like a private bank. And there's this much broader population, as you mentioned. I mean, we worked with a company in Peru, and 80% of people are not on the tax rolls.
Yep.
Right. It's all cash. It's a company called Yape. They created a P2P, and they really didn't expect it to go as far as it did.
Yep.
Because they didn't expect people to want to acknowledge, right, that they had the income that they do. So tell me a little bit about, given that people aren't on the tax rolls.
Yes.
And presumably not on the credit bureaus.
Yep.
What do you use to underwrite?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So the inception of the problem, when Shivani, the CEO, uncovered this problem when she was working in Africa, she realized that this global majority had tremendous economic power, but it was all hidden. As you said, the transactions were hidden. And what she discovered while digging deep, being on the ground, being in shops, in small businesses, is that a lot of these countries, all the transactions show up in your text messages. And so she discovered that, hey, if I could get access to those text messages, I could construct cash flow for this consumer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in every country, we have also explored credit bureau data. There is some, availability of that data for some applicants. But at times, the credit bureau data is also very expensive compared to the size of loans or size of capital that is being accessed. So I would say most of the data has been from, the Android system. Now there are limits to that data, and over time there are growing limits to, how you use that data across the world. And then finally, there's been a lot of investment in proprietary behavioral data you might get from an application, data you might get from questions, data you might get from how you interact with all of Tala's kind of ecosystem. So the behavioral data, the proprietary data has been very powerful. But yes, Google data or SMS data, credit bureau data would be some other examples.
Yeah, we've tried at Capital One. I developed a strategy that I referred to as poke the bear, which was, an attempt to get the customer to reveal credit risk information without necessarily realizing it.
Yes.
And the metaphor I use, I think I got this from someone at Citibank, is if you could look in someone's closet, you'd know whether you wanted to make a loan. So if they keep their closet neat, they probably keep their finances neat, so to speak. So trying to get customers to reveal that. And I think that's a technique that did not work really terribly well in the US because you do have so much data
Yes.
to work with. I mean, it actually worked for us at Capital One and credit line increases, but we have seen it work much better, outside of the US where data is thinner and where you really can learn. Well, I will say, I don't know if you can learn a lot, but you can learn more than nothing. And the more you learn, the more you can slope risk, the better your underwriting can be.
Yes.
So I would imagine that in that environment, repeat borrowers also, has to be a real advantage, right? Once you've got the first loan that's been paid, et cetera, you guys are learning a lot more.
Exactly. The first loan is the trickiest loan in terms of not knowing someone. The fraud rate can be higher. But when somebody comes back to Tala, there's a lot more data you're accumulating about how they interacted with their prior loan, how they interact with, Tala's broader just app or website, etc. Yeah, there is a lot you can glean from that towards underwriting.
Okay, so given how different this is
Yes.
than what you did at Capital One, what is it that did carry over from Capital One?
So I think, there are a lot of things in terms of the fundamentals of lending that absolutely carry over. All the lessons learned have been valuable. I mean, I remember day one on my job, I joined Tala on March 16, 2020, which was the day of the lockdown in the US, but lockdowns had also begun in Philippines and Kenya. And, these consumers used to pay back loans and access loans physically by going to stores, physically returning money. And suddenly you had, loss rates spiking. And again, those lessons from Capital One were invaluable in reacting, how quickly you should react. I'm glad, Tala moved very quickly to make certain decisions because there were at least 2 or 3 local players who didn't survive that period because they didn't move fast enough.
Mhm.
But in terms of, broader learning, some universal truths that played out. Lending has asymmetric risks. When you make money, you make small amounts of money. When you lose money, you can lose a lot. Hence, there are very small margins of error. That holds true. That holds true everywhere. To some extent, I guess only the paranoid survive kind of a thing, which is, hey, you need to also be very, very careful because in a startup, it is easy to move fast, break things. You hear all this, oh, let's do an 80-20, which again, for a lot of things you can.
Yeah.
But when it comes to credit risk, the margins of error are way smaller. And then I would say, finally, the fact that selection rules above everything, right? Your value prop, why should someone choose you? Why should someone repay you? It's an unsecured debt. Unlike the US, like your credit history,
Right.
where it can impact your buying an auto loan, buying a home, maybe getting a job. In a lot of these markets, those consequences don't necessarily exist. So you have to have very, very strong value proposition, which then drives selection. And so all of these things, asymmetric risk, healthy paranoia, and focusing on selection, all of these have played out just as I had hoped they would play out, even in an international environment.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that. One of the things we see with a lot of startups is that, they use their ability to be nimble as an excuse to be a little twitchy, right? And they kind of jump from one thing to the other and don't quite finish anything. So knowing that balance, knowing when to actually move quickly and when to let it ride a little bit, knowing when to 80-20 is I think a real challenge. So you referenced the paying in person. So let's talk about some of the
Yes.
difficulties. We're like, I get annoyed now if I have to even talk to a person to solve a problem here, much less
Yeah.
walk into a bank branch, so to speak. So how did you deal with that across markets?
Yeah, so, again, if you think about Tala is solving for who I said the global majority, people earning $10 a day, But what Tala is solving, I was shocked to learn Tala is effectively building the supply chain infrastructure for serving this customer segment. There are so many things we all take for granted, right? We take for granted underwriting data will be there, like we just already discussed, that is not easily available. We take for granted, just let's think about the apps on our phone. When we get updates these days, some of these app updates are 500 megabytes, a gigabyte. We're talking of this customer segment that doesn't have that kind of storage on their phones. So, how do you think about designing your app to be really, really small in size? We all assume we have, unlimited data. Data is very expensive in these countries. So, how are you going to interact? Wi-Fi access versus phone data, the quality of data and connections. You have to think about language. You're working across countries, different languages. So you may have similar UI, but we all know when you switch languages, some languages take more space to type out similar concepts. And then what you mentioned around money, cash in, we call them cash in and cash out rails. Again, we take for granted in most of the fintech successes that are happening all over the world, which are happening for the top half of the world, where you can just launch a debit card. We tried launching a debit card in one of the countries, and 40% couldn't physically be delivered by the vendor to the locations they had to get to. We take identity for granted, that people will know their identity and have proof of identity. So I think it was very humbling to realize how privileged a lot of us are in just knowing our identity, have accessing to cash in, cash out rails, access to data, access to, phones that have enough storage. And so that's why I say Tala is truly solving the supply chain infrastructure, because there are just so many details that matter that I had to never think about before Tala.
So when you're thinking about, supply chain for cash is scary, right?
Yes.
Cash.
Yes.
Cash is very, very mobile.
Yes.
So were you guys working through money transfer companies or things like that?
Yeah. Tala signed up at more than 250 or 300,000 locations so that people could cash in and cash out. Now, over time, I think COVID was a huge spurt to digital transformation in a lot of these countries. And then every country has been different, right? Kenya was far ahead on digital already with M-Pesa.
Right.
But Philippines was predominantly physical cash in, cash out with different locations. So, yeah, we had to build technology solutions and connections to all kinds of cash intermediaries so that the customer would never have to be too far away and not go way out of the way. But when COVID happened, a lot of people had to adopt digital money movement solutions. And so there has been a huge move towards digital cash in and cash out. But there are still customers and in different countries who prefer cash because they're always afraid. There's a low trust in the system that, hey, if I have money sitting somewhere, some fees or something will take it out. And so still a lot of our customer segment prefer ultimately having cash.
Yeah, we've certainly encountered in some countries, there's just a fear that the government is going to say, you can't have savings over a certain amount. We're just going to take that. You don't have time to react.
Yep.
So Philippines, Kenya, you are in California. Much of the team is in California, but I assume much of the team is also not in California.
Yes.
How do you coordinate across, I'm going to say the sun never sets on Tala?
Yes.
Maybe that's true.
No, very true.
How do you coordinate that?
Look, it's tough. You need processes, you need working norms, and then you need personal discipline to stick to those working norms. Otherwise, you're right. There is always work happening. If you don't find a way to switch off, there's always something happening around the clock. So Tala has organized, into global versus local talent. And then you ask yourself, what is it that only global can do versus what is it that local can do? And when you start separating that work out, you realize that the global team essentially drives frameworks, and the local team can drive tactics and optimizations. If you think about the lending world, maybe 3 countries all want a feature. Let's call a simple feature like auto debit. Instead of each country going and building their own tech, maybe the global team builds the tech. But maybe one country decides, hey, the norm in my country is to have mandatory auto debit. Maybe another country decides, no, I want to have auto debit as an option. Maybe a third country decides, I want to use auto debit for incremental approvals. You essentially have global frameworks, local teams kind of taking global features or global frameworks and adapting them for their local environment, customizing it. Yeah, essentially, lending frameworks are similar, monitoring metrics are similar, how we measure a business is similar. And then within each country, of course, when you get very detailed, the features going into a model, some of them would be different in each country, some of them would be very similar. Languages, of course, are different. You may have different pricing strategies, limits, approved decline thresholds in each country, but the framework of having a fraud model, a credit model, a limit model, all of those would be similar.
Got it. That makes sense. So, last thing I want to talk about is training. We were talking to a founder in Brazil last week, and he said when he started a lending business, he decided to go read everything about lending, and there was almost nothing to read.
Yes.
He found like 2 books. He says, there's probably 100 or 200 or 300 on product management, but it is kind of a curiosity that just doesn't seem to exist for lending. So, I believe, Tala, you created some credit training. Can you talk a little bit about that, who it was for, and kind of what were the key themes?
Yeah, so when I joined Tala, I started finding a little bit of a challenge that folks were assuming that the credit folks and the finance team would take care of the numbers and that everybody else could just focus on product features and the experience. And again, maybe, I'm exaggerating it a bit, but, broadly that was the feeling. And having lived in lending, I realized, no, every role is critical. I mean, engineers are critical, product is critical, compliance is critical. So every role needs to be able to understand how they can influence the economics of lending. And so essentially, yeah, I created something simple like 101, which every new hire in every job family, it just became part of onboarding. And I thought it was, 1 to 2 hours well spent every 2 weeks. So I personally led that training. And then you could opt in based on how you felt after that training for what I call Lending 201. And that was way deeper, where I would, show them examples of how somebody made simple product changes or UI changes at Tala and how they caused surprising results.
Yep.
And you almost did, 1 hour of theory and then did 1 hour of multiple choice questions where you'd ask them, hey, this change is about to go in. Do you think it'll change anything? Like, it could be as small as we had a scroll for loan amounts. Does that scroll, should it start from the lowest amount, go down to the highest amount, or start with the highest amount and go down to the lowest amount? These subtle things folks were not aware of. And yeah, 80% of the people were opting in from 101 to 201. And it was a huge success because, somebody asked me a really profound question during one of these trainings. They said, hey, are you telling us we need to be risk averse? And I said, actually, no. Thank you so much for asking that question. I want you to be risk aware.
Yeah.
Not risk averse, but risk aware, that you have the power when you change the application, when you change the UI, when you make product decisions, you have the power to influence economics. How you treat bugs, how you treat breakdowns in the cash in, cash out process has impact on repayment rates, has impact on cash out rates, which we all know can impact then credit risk and credit selection. So yeah, so the audience was everybody at Tala. The key themes, similar to what we said earlier, we actually first started off by explaining how lending is very different than selling physical goods like a bottle of Coca-Cola. So we explained how almost everything you're doing, you're making decision based on future assumptions and predictions. And then we talked about asymmetric risks, that I mentioned earlier, which is when you make money, you make small amounts of money. When you lose money, you can lose a lot of money. And then spent a lot of time on selection dynamics, helping people understand that I'd ask people a question, what do you think is the most important driver of defaults? Is it the credit model? Is it the recovery strategy? Is it the loan amount? Is it selection? And very few people would say selection.
Right.
They would assume you can do anything and ultimately a credit model will catch it as if it's a living organism that can, adapt to inputs it has never seen before. it was very helpful in democratizing the understanding and empowering everybody to be able to influence outcomes versus thinking that only the credit team and the finance team need to worry about credit risk.
Yeah, I mean, we have a tool that we use, we call it Credit Compass, which walks through the entire customer lifecycle. I think we've had customers question why we needed to do that. And to your point, it's all very integrated. One of the first version of our loan at Zest AI, we had this very cool tool, which was, the x-axis, you could drag how much you wanted, and the y-axis, you would drag how long you wanted to borrow for. And then in the middle, it would tell you, here's what the payment is going to be every other week.
Yep.
I think our default was like $500 for 6 months, and 80% of our applications came in
on default.
$500.
Yes.
For 6 months, and say, so you're happy with $500? I'm like, oh no, I actually need 600 or 700. Yeah, I loved the tool. The tool didn't work for customers. And so really understanding how customers engage, et cetera. And so, as you say, like product management, both from a design experience and design of the product affects it. I think we see a lot exactly what you said. Folks believe that the credit model should just fix everything, and that as long as they drive a lot of traffic, the credit model will find people. And
yes,
I'd say they expect them to turn dross into gold. And
yes.
That just isn't going to happen. So,
yes.
Well, thanks so much for joining me today. I really love your perspective on this. I hadn't heard the term of the physics of lending versus the math of lending. So that's a new one for me. I'm gonna digest on that one. So for everyone else, hey, you can follow us. You can follow EnsembleX and Kunal Kaul on LinkedIn. You can also visit us at ensemblex.com, and you can find the EnsembleX Exchange podcast on all major platforms. Thank you for joining us today, Kunal.
Thank you so much, Shawn, for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thank you all for listening.